really, the globalists want to cause an economic collapse in the United States. They want to cause not just civil unrest, but maybe even a civil war. And they want to be able to blame that on Trump for all of human history, to be able to say, see what happens when you disagree with globalism. See what happens when you promote a free market and America first and national sovereignty and free market and all that kind of stuff. You get chaos, you get collapse.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance. Due to market volatility and demand, we don't have set specials this week, but call us at 888-81-LIBERTY. That's 888-815-4237 to inquire about products we have in stock, our buyback and swap quotes, and to get the best prices and most personal service in the industry. We look forward to speaking with you.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. I'm always delighted to have this returning guest. Alex Newman is a correspondent at the Epoch Times. He's also the founder of Liberty Sentinel. He joins us this Monday, January 5th, 2026. Alex, thank you for coming back on Liberty and Finance.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Dunnigan.
Wanted to get you to weigh in, as you've written recently, on the Maduro regime change in Venezuela and perhaps the legality of that as far as, and the precedent that it sets, and some of the underlying reasons for it, the official story versus what may be behind that. And then we're going to talk about some your 2026 financial look ahead, not only regarding our currency, gold, silver, and stable coins, but just privacy and rights in the face of AI in general, all in the next 20 minutes. So let's get going. First, if you could hit us with your perspective of the implications and the reality behind the Maduro regime change.
Well, there's a lot of different angles to look at this through, Dunnigan, and I'll start by saying that I have been exposing the international communist movement in Latin America my entire journalistic career. One of my first really significant investigative pieces appeared in the New American back in 2010, and it was an in-depth look on the communist takeover of Latin America. Some analysts were starting to talk about a pink tide at that time. And I grew up in Latin America, so it's a region that's near and dear to me. I know most Americans really don't care all that much about what's happening in Latin America, but I spent almost all of my childhood there. And what was happening was the entire region was being taken over very quietly by a communist movement with help from the deep state in the United States. There's a shadowy network called the Sao Paulo Forum that was founded in 1990 by Fidel Castro and the current president of Brazil, a communist criminal, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. And their goal was to rebuild in Latin America what had been lost in Eastern Europe. That's how they actually put it in their 1997 minutes for their annual meeting. That, of course, being communist slavery. And on its own, that wouldn't have been all that remarkable. But what was happening was they had very powerful support from the deep state in the United States and in Europe, and that's how they were able to make so much progress. And at this founding meeting, it wasn't just the mass-murdering dictator Fidel Castro. They also brought in the FARC in Colombia, the mass-murdering narco-terrorists who now have practically taken over Colombia with help from George Soros and Barack Obama and Joe Biden. And the goal ultimately was to take the whole Western Hemisphere, which, of course, by definition means taking down the United States of America. And what this network specialized in was using proceeds, really illegitimate criminal proceeds, for funding revolution. And Venezuela was exhibit A in this whole process. Drug trafficking going through Venezuela, absolutely a huge industry, but also even the oil money, right? They seized and took over all of the foreign oil assets there. The American companies lost their assets that they had paid for there. They were nationalized. And then this money was suddenly being used not to distribute to the people of Venezuela, as so many leftists and even some on the right would have us believe, but it was being used to fund revolution across the continent, across the region, with the full backing of communist China and the Russians. So what was happening in Venezuela was extremely concerning. Whether Trump's approach to this is the right approach, I can't say. I'm glad I don't have to make these decisions. But we need to be clear here. Maduro was not just a threat to his own people. He was a brutal dictator. He had massive gulags filled with political prisoners. He was a threat to the United States of America, and he was working with subversives in this country. I mean, who could forget the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement going down there and publicly posting pictures of themselves on Twitter standing next to this barbarian. So, again, whether Trump did the right thing with this, I don't know. Again, I'm glad I'm not having to make these decisions, but the fact is Maduro was a big threat. Not just, again, to his own people who were starving, who were eating their pets, who were malnourished, 12 million of whom have already had to escape that country, once one of the most prosperous countries in the world. And so, frankly, the world will probably be a better place without Maduro in power. But what comes next for Venezuela is anybody's guess. And I think, unfortunately, it could go south very quickly if good systems aren't put into place. And frankly, I don't know that the American people want to be involved in, nation building. Hearing Trump talk about we're going to be taking over Venezuela for the time being, that's not what his voters voted for when they thought we were going to make America great again. So he's got a very delicate balance to strike here between, not becoming a neocon, foreign interventionist, regime change, getting us bogged down in endless wars that cost trillions of dollars that we can't afford, and protecting the United States from very real threats around the world.
In addition to that, well, as long as you're talking about what direction Trump is taking us, he's just recently announced a new Trump class of battleships that are going to be built at the cost of trillions of dollars. Overall expansion in the military from a government which, if you believe what Margaret Thatcher said decades ago, the governments have no money that they don't either take from their citizens or print out of thin air. Any comments from you on the economic and financial realities of military adventurism in this financial environment that we find ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, everybody who watches your program knows that the United States government is in big financial trouble. $40 trillion in debt, maybe 200 or more trillion in unfunded liabilities. The U.S. government is in a major mess. With that said, one of the few powers that the U.S. Congress does have under our U.S. Constitution is to operate and maintain a Navy. We need a Navy. I believe the U.S. government should have the most powerful Navy in the world. I believe we should have very powerful Air Force and Space Force now that it's there, because that is the battle zone of the 21st century, that and cybersecurity and cyberspace. So I want the U.S. government to be able to protect the American people and more importantly, to protect our liberties, to protect our fundamental rights, our God-given rights to life, liberty, and property in a very hostile world where the Communist Chinese and the Russians and the globalists here at home are absolutely determined to destroy our sovereignty, destroy our independence, and merge us into a totalitarian one-world system. So, obviously, the U.S. government needs to rein in spending, and rein in spending is really putting it very mildly. I mean, we need to slash and burn. This cannot continue. But all of it is a moot point until we get the monetary system under control. As long as we have a Federal Reserve System that creates money out of nothing based on debt and loans it to the U.S. government, it requires perpetually growing spending just to keep the whole scam going a little bit longer. So, do we need fancy new battleships? I don't know. Do we need a powerful Navy? Absolutely. Is that something the federal government should be doing? Absolutely. But we have to get the spending under control. And there's a lot of ways to do that. I don't believe the U.S. government needs to spend $1 trillion a year on so-called defense, shutting down a lot of bases overseas, cutting a lot of wasteful spending. There are plenty of places where we could be cutting spending. And, I do think we're probably headed for a third world war. And I think the globalists are trying to engineer this outcome. So we've got a lot of different angles that this needs to be considered from, Dunnigan. And I know that sounds like a non-answer to your question, but again, I think it's important to look at this from all angles. I do believe the CCP is a major threat to the United States now that American globalists have built it up for many decades. And so we need to be able to protect ourselves from the very technologies that our treasonous leaders, both in corporate world and in government world, have transferred over to this mass murdering gaggle of tyrants in Beijing. And a part of that, of course, is being able to maintain our naval superiority, which means we need to find a way to build more ships, build better ships. I mean, if you look honestly at the Chinese Navy, the People's Liberation Navy, it's a very formidable force. They are able to crank out ships like there's no tomorrow. We can hardly keep our old ships running. So we have a big problem. And I think Trump does need to look very seriously at keeping our Navy up to date so that it can protect our country.
Something that you've warned us about in the past that has resonated with our audience is that in the name of protecting us, governments have usurped their illegitimate power and impose that on the people to where we've lost most of our privacy, most of our constitutional rights, our constitutional money, and so many things, all in the name of protecting us. We saw huge losses of liberty and freedom over the past 4 years regarding medical protection. We're going to keep us safe in that way. now you mentioned cybersecurity, same thing. What about the administration now embracing, now we're going to have to be Trump says he wants to be the AI president, and that this is to protect us from the threat of the communist Chinese, just like they were going to protect us from supposedly foreign developed biological threats by developing them faster in our own side. This arms race of many different dimensions. Isn't that sometimes a Trojan horse that takes away our privacy in the name of protecting us?
It absolutely is, Dunnigan. And I think fundamental to understanding this is to understand that from the very beginning, subversive globalists in the United States have been aiding and abetting the communist Chinese monster. And again, I don't want to downplay the seriousness of the CCP. The CCP, I believe, is a major threat to America, a major threat to freedom, a major threat to everything that we hold dear. But that's primarily because it has been built up for decades by the American taxpayer, by the American government. So what we're seeing with this AI race is very interesting. Now, on the one hand, I understand the United States needs to maintain technological superiority over communist China. But that was not very difficult to do. Communist systems, totalitarian systems, do not innovate like free market systems. The only reason communist China has any innovation today is because they have introduced a few basic market mechanisms and because we have trained hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of their best engineers and their best scientists at American universities. Why we did that boggles the mind. But here's what really bothers me, Dunnigan. Trump is saying that we need to do all this AI stuff. We need to waste all this taxpayer money on all these AI programs. We need to stop state regulation of AI, et cetera, under the guise of keeping up with communist China. But at the same time, we're going to allow NVIDIA to buy some of our most advanced technological hardware systems so that they can continue, the communist Chinese can continue to accelerate their development here. But I heard a very good analogy that I think is very apropos when it comes to communist China and AI. This is like, somebody water skiing behind a boat, right? The United States is driving the boat. Our country is far and ahead the leader when it comes to technological innovation. The communist Chinese are holding on to a rope behind us. And it's like saying, hey, they're going to catch us. They're going to catch us. We got to pour more taxpayer money into this. We got to do this. We got to do that and the other. We got to take away privacy. We got to ban state regulation of AI so that they're not going to catch us because they're holding onto a rope. They're copying our technology. They're being given our technology by subversive forces within our own government and within the corporate world. So I think the real solution to this isn't to give up our freedom and our privacy. It's to stop the technology transfer from the United States to communist China. And that's a very simple thing to do. I'm not a absolutist when it comes to the free market. I don't believe we ought to sell dangerous technology to our geopolitical foes. And unfortunately, our government and our corporations have been doing that for generations. And it may cost us dearly, certainly our children.
If we could get your 2026 look ahead, I know we only have about 15 minutes left or less, on several fronts. First of all, we've already touched on geopolitically, at least in one dimension. Maybe you want to expand on that, but also on your view of the future in the next year for the U.S. dollar and the U.S. debt market, but also the prospect of stable coins being officially taking the place of CBDCs, because Trump has scored a lot of political points by coming out and banning, or executive order banning, central bank digital currencies, as he had promised in his election campaign. But now we've got this, wait a minute, what happened? The Genius Act is going to introduce private companies or public companies to come out with stable coins. What happens to our privacy and our freedom there, and gold and silver as well? As is that still your preferred remedy for people who want to maintain their privacy and their wealth?
Yeah, this is an area that is deeply concerning to me, Dunnigan. If you look at the people within the Trump administration who are leading the charge on this, it's basically a collection of the people that I least trust in the administration. Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, AI czar David Sachs, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. I mean, if I had to pick out the 5 or 10 least trustworthy people in this administration, it's all the people that are working on this, the stable coins, the tokenization of all these assets. These are people with a long history of involvement with the deep state, whether it be George Soros, whether it be Hillary Clinton. Howard Lutnick, until not that long ago, was a big Democrat donor. He was a big advocate of carbon credits. Why is this guy so involved in this trend towards stable coins and these kinds of things? So I'm very concerned about all this. Whether Trump understands it all or not, I don't know. Not that that's an excuse. He's the president. He has an obligation to try to understand all these things. And if he doesn't, to get advice from trustworthy people who can explain these things to him. So I'm very concerned about those things. Yes, it was good that we banned CBDC, but it sure looks to me like the Genius Act, the Stable Act, the Clarity Act, all these things look to me like CBDC by the back door. We know the Bank for International Settlements is still hard at work on building the international blockchain ledger through which they hope to have all these tokenized assets traded internationally, by the way, with digital currencies, which of course require digital IDs. So we're still moving, unfortunately, into this dystopian digital gulag. I don't think Trump wants that. I could be wrong, but we're still moving in that direction. And, even assuming he doesn't want it, and even assuming he's got some super secret plan to stop it, the groundwork is still being laid so that when he's out of office in 3 years, we're going to see not just a resumption of this, but we'll see all the progress that was made even over the second Trump administration. So I'm very concerned about all those things. I have been very, very skeptical of the U.S. dollar for a long time. The U.S. dollar is in a very precarious position. What Trump is doing internationally, for example, this operation in Venezuela, and recently he's been talking about now, Colombia may be next, or Iran may be next. That could go one of two ways, right? It could convince the rest of the world, we better fall in line, or we might be next. Or it could convince the rest of the world, hey, the United States is completely out of control. We cannot continue to play along with this anymore. We've got to build rival systems. We've got to de-dollarize. We've got to stop buying this garbage treasury paper. And we've got to try a new approach. So which way it will end up going, I don't know. If the rest of the world does fall in line and say, all right, the United States is still the top dog and there's nothing we can do to challenge it without putting ourselves at great risk, we could see, even just today when we're recording this, Doug, and the dollar's up. I follow closely the dollar versus the Swiss franc, and the dollar's quite a bit up today versus the Swiss franc. Could that persist for another few years? Sure. But I think over the long term, the dollar's demise is almost inevitable without some radical changes. And you asked about precious metals. When I talk about radical changes, that's the kind of radical change I'm talking about. Ending the fiat debt-based currency system and going back toward a legitimate monetary system. And Trump has, I know there's a lot of people who don't like him, but Trump has in the past many times indicated his support for a gold-backed currency, for some sort of honest, reliable, sound money system. Whether he believes it or not, I can't know. I don't know what's going on in his head, but he has certainly talked about this publicly many times, going back for at least a decade. I know people around him who have indicated that he does support restoring an honest currency. If that were to happen, we could see great things happen with the dollar, although it wouldn't be the same dollar that we're dealing with today. It wouldn't be a garbage fiat currency printed by a cartel of mega banks masquerading as a federal agency. So I think we're in a period of very serious uncertainty, Dunnigan, where things could go one of several ways, very few of those ways being good, by the way, in terms of stability and peace and prosperity. And so for me personally, I am still heavily invested in silver. I'm still heavily invested in gold. And on the even more bearish side, I'm heavily invested in rural land and even, prepping supplies, which sounds kind of goofy, but long-term storable food, I think it might be a good investment right now. And I'm only half kidding. So I think we could see all of this spiral out of control very quickly. I certainly hope it doesn't come to that. I hope Trump has some sort of super master plan and that, things don't spiral out of control. But the way things are going, I think there's a very real risk of that. And I think really the globalists want to cause an economic collapse in the United States. They want to cause not just civil unrest, but maybe even a civil war. And they want to be able to blame that on Trump for all of human history, to be able to say, see what happens when you disagree with globalism. See what happens when you promote a free market and America first and national sovereignty and free market and all that kind of stuff. You get chaos, you get collapse. So I think Trump could be walking into a trap. He's probably a smart man. I suspect he has some understanding of the different forces around him. But I think it's a very volatile period, and gold and silver tend to do well during volatile periods.
It's interesting when we talk about, maybe we'll get a new dollar. According to our Constitution and the Coinage Act of 1792, the definition of the U.S. dollar as a unit of currency is 371.25 grains of pure silver. Any thoughts from you about that we're supposed to have, and you mentioned a financial system based on assets, not on debt. And that's supposed to provide us then with the ability to save the fruits of our labor over periods of time for our savings and our retirement and our children and progeny beyond them. And people to look forward to something in their life, building something in their life of value rather than being beholden to a system that only grants them credits and can withdraw those credits if they don't just toe the line. Any thoughts to you on the rights of the people as seen by our founders on true currency, true money?
Yeah, and the founders were absolutely clear about this, right? They granted Congress the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. They did not grant Congress the power to establish a central bank that could print money out of thin air and force us to use it by loaning it to the U.S. government and then forcing us to pay taxes in it. In other words, the system we have today. And actually, if you go into Article 1, Section 10, you'll read that that states may not make anything other than gold and silver a tender in payment of debts. So I've been very encouraged to see a lot of states moving in this direction. Florida, Texas, Missouri, Utah, Arkansas, multiple states now have moved in the direction of restoring gold currency, at least as an alternative to the failing dollar. I have heard from well-informed people that there are people within the Trump administration that want to do something similar to this on a national level. I hope that is true, but the founders were crystal clear, right? They did not want this kind of arbitrary power in the hands of anyone, not the government, not a private cartel of bankers. That's why they didn't delegate that power to the Congress in the first place. And so I think from statute, from the Constitution, it's very clear we need to go back to an honest money system. And frankly, Dunnigan, all these other problems that we're talking about, the obliteration of our freedoms, the move toward a global system, all of that traces back to the fake currency system, the dishonest currency system we have. If we could stop the money fraud, we could stop so many of the other evils that we're seeing right now. The effort to take away our property, the great taking, of course, which you and I have talked about in the past. All of that could be stopped in its tracks if we could restore honest money. But that's a big if. It's going to be a heavy lift, and I think there's a lot of people who would sooner blow this country up than allow the most powerful country in the world with the most powerful military in the world to go back to an honest currency system.
Alex, for people who want to follow your work, how should they do that?
So my website is libertysentinel.org. People can sign up for a free newsletter there. Also, thenewamerican.com. I serve as senior editor at The New American. People should go sign up for our free daily headlines there. That's where you'll get the real news every day delivered straight to your inbox, even if you're not a subscriber to the print magazine. And then also for those who want to get their children out of the government brainwash camps, I personally use Classical Conversations with my children. It's a wonderful, wonderful program. It's available not just around the United States, but around the world. And those are the main ways. And also on X, AlexNewman_JOU.
Alex, thank you for joining us here again on Liberty and Finance.
Thank you so much, Dunnigan.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance. Due to market volatility and demand, we don't have set specials this week, but call us at 888-81-LIBERTY. That's 888-815-4237 to inquire about products we have in stock, our buyback and swap quotes, and to get the best prices and most personal service in the industry. We look forward to speaking with you.